So a few weeks ago, I was walking around Lake Ann. It's one of my favorite things to do, middle of the day, if it's a nice day, to get out and walk around Lake Ann. And it's about a 1.5 mile walk, and if you keep the lake on your left the whole time, you won't get lost. And I was walking around Lake Ann, and I was at almost the very end of the walk, and there was an older gentleman in a suit. And there were some other folks who were working on gardening and stuff, and there was an older gentleman in a suit, and he walked through, and he looked very lost. He was sort of aimlessly wandering, and all of a sudden he goes, "This is where Mon Ami Gabi is, right?" And one of the women said, yeah, I think so. And another one of the women said, no, that's not here. And I, of course, wanted to get involved, because that's who I am. And I said, no, that's actually at the town center. That's not here. And he said, where's the town center? And I said, it's a good solid walk. Like, it's a mile and a half away. I don't know exactly, but it's a good distance. And one of the women said, I tell you what, come sit in my yard, and we'll get him to get you a cab. Well, I have not ever called a cab, I don't think. So I'm like, okay, I'm on my phone trying to figure out to get a cab. And another one of the women came up and she said, don't call him a cab. She said, I'll drive him over to the town center. And this guy got a ride over to the town center. I thought it was a really beautiful thing to see the community coming together for this vulnerable man who was lost and didn't know where he was going. The next morning, I got up and I was driving my kids to school, and as we were heading towards the elementary school, we live about a mile from the school, there was a kid that we know who was frantically biking on his bike back towards his house. And I thought that was odd. School is that way, and he's going this way. And I get up a little further, and I see a kid who's laying down on the side of the road. His bike has fallen, and he's sitting on the sidewalk, and he's bleeding. And I see 3 moms who have stopped, and they're bandaging him up. And they're helping him, and they're caring for him. And I thought, wow, look at the way the community is caring for this small child. This vulnerable kid who's fallen off his bike. His buddy is biking back home to try to save him while these other people are caring for him. And then we were in our life group, the Tuesday night young professionals group. And we're sitting there, and we start talking about the book. And I asked Caitlin if I could share this story. And Caitlin's in our group, and she said, hey, by the way, I can't read the book because I'm blind. Right? I'm not able to read this book. She didn't say that. That's my words, right? She said, I can't read this book because there's no audio version yet. And I said, well, maybe the group should just come over and read it to you every night before you go to bed, right? I'm joking. And somebody in the group said, hey, we could record the chapters of the book for you. And we could read them. And Caitlin sort of laughed it off because she said, oh, I thought they were joking. And then guess what? They did. I think they're through chapter 4 or 5 right now, reading the chapters and recording them. Friends, there is something beautiful when people stand up in a community and they say, we're going to care for the vulnerable in our community. That it matters that people feel included. It's a really easy thing to say that we're people who include people when we actually don't do anything to include people. But it's a really beautiful thing when we actually do. It's a beautiful thing to see a community step up. We've been in this sermon series, and we're in the 5th week now as we head towards Easter, where we're talking about the reckless love of Jesus and how Jesus seems to turn the things of the times upside down on their head and step out and really confuse people. And we started the first week and we said, hey, we've got to begin with love. That's really important. And we said once we begin with love, we can start to expand the circle. And we talked about the reason that we can expand that circle is because God offers lavish love to us. And then we talked about if we actually start to receive that lavish love, we can become more open-hearted to caring for people ourselves. And this week, I want to talk specifically about how Jesus pushes us and calls us not simply to love, not simply to include, but to value the vulnerable. Do you see the difference in include and value? It's like people have that conversation about the word tolerate. Value means to see value in someone and perhaps even to bring value to someone. When we look, friends, at the work that Jesus did, when we look at what he did with the disciples, so much of it was against the social norms of the day. To take people to interact with and to love and to get to know and to care for the vulnerable in the situation. The social norms of Jesus' day and the laws from the rabbis were very clear about who was in and who was out, who deserved honor, who deserved privilege, and Jesus just turns it all upside down on its head. Friends, when Jesus goes out and he seeks out the most vulnerable in society, his love not only enables people to feel valued, but he actually gives them more value. He gives them more value as the disciples who walk with him see, oh, that person must be important. As people who journey together with the vulnerable see the value that Jesus brings them. Because, friends, I believe at the core of every human, there is one main desire. That's simply to belong. I believe that's at the core, that people want to feel valued, that they want to feel like they're important in a situation. I think we find security, we flourish when we're in that place. I want you to listen to these phrases. You don't belong here. You're not like us. Get out of here. Have you ever heard anybody use these words? Maybe you haven't heard the words, but you have felt that feeling when you walk in somewhere and everyone looks at you and they give you the look of, oh, you don't belong here. Or perhaps they simply ignore you. That's almost even worse, right? When people don't engage you at all, or you look and you see it and we say, oh, that's just something for school children. Friends, that is something that happens right now. All over our world, in our current culture. There's a story that I heard this last week. Susan, my wife, listens to Dax Shepard's podcast, I think every day. But there's a story that she encouraged me to listen to. And it's called Experts on Expert. And the guest was a guy named John Hari. And he told this story about the summer of 2011 in this small complex in Berlin. It's an anonymous complex. He wouldn't say the name of it. But he talked about how there was this woman there, a Muslim woman named Nuria. And Nuria's in a wheelchair, and one day she climbs out of her wheelchair, and she puts a sign in her window in the complex. She's on the ground floor. And the sign says this. It says, I got a notice that I'm going to be evicted on Thursday. So on Wednesday night, I'm going to kill myself. This is a true story, a real thing that happened. She puts this sign up on her window. And all of a sudden, people in her community started to notice this sign. Right? People who live there. See, this community was filled with vulnerable, the outcast in this culture, in this society. It was filled with Muslim immigrants. It was filled with gay men. And it was filled with punk squatters. That's who lived in the midst of this community. People who had showed up and were staying. And no one knew each other. There were no relationships. There were no people connecting in this community until they see Nuria's sign in the window. A sign like that will grab your attention, right? So they come and they knock on the door and she doesn't answer. Go away, go away, go away. And they knock on the door and they knock on the door. And finally they decide, we must do something for this woman. She won't come out of her place. This is not fair. So they start to gather people, not even people that they know, just knocking on doors and gathering people from the community. Because everyone's rent was going to go up, and nobody was excited about that. And they said, let's do something. So they barricaded the front of the community. They stood out there, and they barricaded the front. And they said, we're going to barricade the front of this community until they change the rule, until they don't raise our rent. So they go and they knock on Nuria's apartment again, and they say, we've decided we're going to barricade this community. And she says, all right, wheel me out there. I'll sit with you. This barricade goes on for almost a year. 24 hours a day. They stand out in this community. And what they decide is, because they still have to work, right? They're going to take shifts. So one day in the midst of this year, Nuria is out there, this Muslim woman, still alive, by the way, sitting out in the front of this community. And Tanya, who is one of the young punk women, Nuria is covered from head to toe in clothes, and Tanya is in a very, very short miniskirt. And Nuria decides in that moment when Tanya comes out, there's nothing we have in common. We'll just sit out here and not talk. Tanya felt the same way. A few moments into their time together, someone said something, and he doesn't tell in the story, but something about opening up their story, and they realized they had something very, very similar in common. They were both rejected from their families, and that's why they ended up in this community. Tanya and Nuria become good friends. Such an odd combination, right? An odd friendship. And then in the midst of this time, they build an actual physical structure in the front of the neighborhood because they're like, well, we can't block the whole thing, but we can physically block. I mean, the police are coming like every day, by the way. And they build this structure, and all of a sudden, one day, this man with cognitive disabilities wanders into the community, and they say, hey, come, you can live here in this structure that's in the front of the community. The police are searching for the man. They come and they find him. See, the community finds out he had been in a padded cell for 20 years. The police take him back into custody, and guess what happens? People from the community go to the police station and they say, we want him back. We love him. You don't care about him. He matters to us. Bring him back. So the man comes back and he lives in the midst of the community. Now this sounds like a fabricated story, right? Like it can't be real. This is a true story. Finally, they got the rent not to be raised. Finally, those who were in control of the apartment complex said, all right, we'll let it be. And Nuria talks about in the story, she talks about the fact that it was really great that her rent didn't get raised. It was really great that she was still alive. But the best thing that came out of this was the relationships that she built with people who were different from her in her community. She now felt like she had family. Not a family she would have ever designed for herself. But the vulnerable in this community were taking care of each other. Have you ever felt, have you ever thought, have you ever heard things like, these are the people who are in and these are the people who are out? Maybe you've heard, we're in and you're out. Maybe, as I said earlier, it's one of those things that you remember from middle school. It's funny, I heard a mom talking about a middle school in our community yesterday at a sports event, and she's like, middle school's great. My kid loves middle school. I do not remember middle school that way. I'm like, your kid must go to some golden middle school. Middle school was awful, right? You walk into the cafeteria that first time, and they haven't decided where you're going to sit. And in between classes, and all of a sudden, people that you were friends with in elementary school no longer act like they know you. And you have figured out sometime between 6th grade and 12th grade who's in and who's out, and at some period in that time, you're one of those people. And I think into our adulthood, we sit on those feelings and we hang on to those, and they're hard and they're difficult. And sometimes we enact those same things towards other people. Right? We create those boundaries because we find security in our own lives where we go, all right, I'm finally in, so I can't let that person in because that might dilute my inness. Right? And we start to build those walls and build those boundaries, but that is not what Jesus is about, friends. Jesus is not about creating who's in and who's out. The very ones that Jesus goes looking for are the people who are out, who are on the outside. I mean, think about it for a second. The people who are left over, the people who are left out in story after story, every tribe, every nation, Jesus goes after them, seeks them, gives them value. And all of a sudden, other people want to listen to their stories. All of a sudden, they bring value. I want to take us back to 1 John today. I want to look at chapter 3, and I only want to look at 3 simple verses. 1 John 3, starting with 16. It says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and when we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. Last week I said the scripture was very confusing. This week I think it's pretty clear. I don't think the message that John writes here is at all confusing. Bring value to the valueless in society. It is not simply enough to say or to take pity on someone, but we must do something. Think if the people in Nuria's community had knocked on the door and said, oh, we feel bad for you. We're sorry. How would that have changed her situation? How would that have changed how she felt and how she was valued? Friends, this comes from the love that we have in Christ, right? The scripture says it. We know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. That was the song we were singing. We know that love, and that love is for all people. That love is for the vulnerable in our culture. And in joyous response to that love that we talked about a few weeks ago, that lavish love, we receive this challenge in the scripture. Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. It's a really nice thing to say, well, we love all people. It's a really different thing to prove it. It's a really different thing to show it. It's a really different thing to embody it and live it out. So how do we do that? I want to give us a few things this morning, a few things that I've actually picked up from listening to you over the last few weeks as people have shared their stories. As people have told me what they've done with living this reckless love out. So here's the first thing. Be curious. Be curious about other people. If you want to value the vulnerable, if you want to seek out relationships with those who are not like you, or those who may be in need of welcome in a community, be willing to know them. Seek out people that you don't know. Listen to their stories. Hear their stories. Don't worry so much about saying, well, your story reminds me of this in my story. But listen. Hear them. You know, one of the great ways to make somebody feel valued is to simply listen to them. Let them speak and share their story without judgment, without comparison, but simply to listen. Be curious and genuinely be curious. Don't do it just because I said do it, but actually be curious about the vulnerable. Here's the second thing. Engage people. Or do you know what Jesus does with the disciples? He takes them with him. And he doesn't just say, that woman over there, you should love her, and that guy, pay attention to him, and that. What does Jesus do? He takes them into the place and engages folks. And he takes the disciples with them and shows them. There's intentionality in that taking and that engaging. And I wonder who in your community, who do you know or you don't know, that God is calling you to invest time in, to engage, simply to sit, as I said, be curious and listen, and then get to know their story. Hear them. Share life with them. It wasn't until Nuria and Tanya shared life together, that they stood together, that they engaged one another, that something happened. Here's the third thing. Have expectations. In Tom Berlin's book that many of us are reading, he calls us to have expectations. You know, one of the phrases that I really hate that the church uses is when it says, hey, I saved that person. Right? When somebody says, I saved that person. Friends, I want to be clear. We don't save people. Right? That's the work of God. But we should have expectations that people will respond. Right? We should have expectations that people can do something. We should not pity people, but we should have expectation of relationship. And I know for some people that's a really hard word. How do you expect things about other people? If you truly engage people, if you truly spend time with them, if you truly want to know their story, expect that they might share something back. Expect that God might do something so big in that moment that they might ask you questions because they want to know more. Expect that something will happen. Because if not, we go into every situation thinking that it's just a blip and we check off a box, instead of expecting that community and relationship might happen. Nuria actually had to agree to come out of her house. They didn't pick her up and carry her out. Expect that something will happen. And here's the last one, and I debated whether or not even bringing this out because it seems so simple, but I think we have to hear it. Be kind. Be kind. This seems like such a fundamental thing, such a basic piece of people who call themselves the church. But be kind. Just like we said in the beginning, that we need to begin every day and every conversation and every moment with love. Kindness is in the midst of that, friends. I want you to think for a second, how long has it been, and I can tell you mine, how long has it been since you were unkind? It's a hard thing to think about when we start to analyze it. And I think a lot of our lack of kindness is what keeps people on the outsides, is what keeps people at bay, is what keeps people feeling like they don't have value. Kindness brings value, and it feels so simple, y'all. But Jesus' sure acts showed his kindness. The engagement, the love that he shared showed his kindness. I think it's important for us as we go through this whole series to remember that we're on a journey. I say that a lot, and sometimes people say, what do you mean we're on a journey? I don't believe in the 0 to 60 when it comes to a relationship with God. I don't think I can do it in like 10 seconds. All of a sudden, I've got it all figured out. I believe it's a journey. And I believe in our journey, we make mistakes and we mess up and we screw up. So if you're here this morning, you're going, wow, I am not very kind. Start working on it. If you think, I don't ever engage people who are vulnerable, start doing it. The story is not over. You are on the journey. I am on the journey. We are on this journey together. This morning, I was talking to somebody about this beautiful community that connects to our school right here where we worship. This community where we have folks that come, but we don't often go in and engage and visit this community. Friends, it's time for us to go and engage and visit, to step out, to be kind, to engage, and to love. Jesus gives the vulnerable, as he shares the story, he gives the vulnerable this title. He calls them sons and daughters. There is very little that is more intimate than a parent with their children. Jesus gives them value as his own children. Today, I want you to grab your heart on your seat, not physical one. I realize clarity is important. I want you to grab your heart. And if you're willing today, I want you to think back over the last couple of weeks, maybe a couple of days in your life. Who is a person that you know is vulnerable, or maybe that you've seen that might be vulnerable, maybe a person who's sort of on the outsides of your group, your society. And instead of writing their name today, I want you to write a value that you might see in that person. A value in them. And you may not even know them. So the value might be that they're human. A value might be that they are loved by God. A value might be that they can clearly articulate their message because there's somebody who shares their story a lot. Whatever the value is, I want you to write that value on your heart this morning. And if you can't think of a person, if you really can't think of one person who's vulnerable, and it could be a child. I mean, I'm not talking simply about the poor. Remember my 3 stories that I gave in the beginning. If you can't think of a person who is vulnerable, I want you to write on your heart, God, reveal to me. Show me. Again, these hearts just end up on this tree. You can't read any of them. But on Easter Sunday, our hope is to show physically that the love goes beyond just each week. The love steps out. That's the message that Jesus gives us. Y'all, there are too many people in the world today that don't see value. That don't see value in themselves. That can't hear that message. You are a beloved son or daughter of God. And I think, frankly, one of our biggest jobs, if we are people who call ourselves Christians, is to show them that. Is to show them that they are loved and they are valued. I don't know about you, but when it comes to the work of the church, that's the kind of work I want to do. I want to be in the business that Jesus seems to be about. The business not simply of loving people with our words, but loving people with our actions and bringing value to those who are vulnerable.